Tonight, you're not scrolling through headlines or chasing the day into one more corner. You're sitting by a window that doesn't argue back, while the world does that quiet thing it does when it thinks nobody is watching. Before you fall asleep, you'll step onto a platform where goodbyes are treated like paperwork. You'll watch how policy becomes routine bells, lines, rules, uniforms soft-spoken and relentless. And you'll see how a small detail, a haircut, a renamed child, a folded ticket can carry the weight of an entire system. 3 details to hold gently: a train wheel clicking in the dark, oil lamp smoke and winter wool in the air, a school bell that rings and then hesitates. Something nearby keeps time, maybe the click of a carriage joint, maybe the patient snip of scissors, slow and obedient. And if your breathing starts to follow it, that's perfect. Inhale 4, exhale 6. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing only if you want to. And if you share where and what time you're listening from, maybe that little bell will remember you there, holding its breath the same way. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with a battlefield or a loud villain. It begins with a form that has a blank line where a name used to be, and a child's life being processed like a file that needs to move. You might not expect an entire childhood to be rearranged by paperwork, but that is often how systems prefer to move. Not with shouting, not with a dramatic flourish. Just a form that has a blank line where a name used to be, and a signature that turns a living person into an administrative outcome. Somewhere a train wheel clicks in a steady rhythm. Somewhere scissors whisper near an ear. Somewhere a school bell rings and then holds its breath a little longer than you'd like. The first thing to understand is that a policy is often made of paper long before it is made of buildings. A phrase can become a procedure if enough people repeat it with confidence. Kill the Indian, save the man was not just a sentence thrown into history like a stone into a pond. In practice, it became a kind of blueprint and idea that institutions could file, fund, and enforce. When a belief is written down, it gains pockets. It can be carried. It can be stamped. It can be sent to someone's desk in a neat envelope that smells faintly of ink and certainty. Official language like to call removal education because education sounds tidy, like a slate wiped clean. But the goal leaned toward cultural erasure, even when the paperwork wore polite clothes. The child was treated as raw material. The community was treated as an inconvenience. Rules arrived with calm authority: what to wear, what to say, what to pray, how to stand, how to sit, and sometimes even how to smile on. Command as if a human face were a lamp that could be switched on for inspections. There is a special kind of cruelty that comes in complete sentences. It is not impulsive. It is administrative. It arrives with a timetable. It is signed in ink that dries quickly. Breathe in for 4, out for 6, and notice how a system can do harm while sounding like it's discussing inventory. Transfer, placement, attendance. Words that feel like they should belong to books, not to lives. And then, because paper likes to travel, the policy becomes a ticket away from home. Sometimes the separation began with pressure, sometimes with promises, sometimes with force, sometimes with a mixture that was even worse because it left families wondering which part was real. A child might be told it was an opportunity, and then discover that opportunities often come with locks. Distance did part of the work. Visits became rare, letters could be controlled, and grief was easier for officials to ignore from far away. The mechanics of separation were often ordinary: a wagon, a train, a list of names. A person saying, "It's time," as if time were a friendly guide instead of a wedge. A child's world could shrink from a living community into a timetable. Wake, line up, eat, work, class, sleep, repeat. In that repeat, the system hoped the old self would fade, the way a language fades when nobody is allowed to speak it above a whisper. If you imagine the scene gently, without forcing it into a sharp picture, you might notice how quiet it could look from the outside. A building, a yard, meat rows. It could resemble many schools, which is part of what made it possible. The harm didn't always announce itself with theatrical villainy. It often hid in the normal, in the way normal can become a costume that covers a lot of wrongness, as long as the buttons are aligned. Arrival often meant immediate transformation because institutions love a first day. Not for the child, but for the system. Haircut, clothes replaced. Bodies arranged into sameness, so difference could be treated like a mistake that needed correction. Names were changed or simplified, sometimes so the school could pronounce them, sometimes so the records could file them more neatly, as if identity were a difficult word that should be shortened for convenience. Uniforms made children look orderly, which is a word that sounds like a compliment until you remember what it is being used to erase. The uniform could turn a room full of distinct lives into something interchangeable. And interchangeability is very soothing to bureaucracy. It reduces questions, it reduces empathy, it makes people easier to count. You can almost hear the relief in a ledger when everyone fits into the same columns. Eventide got a uniform. Bells divided the day into clean slices, like someone portioning bread. It was time to wake, time to line up, time to eat, time to work, time to speak, and time to be silent. If you've ever set a phone alarm and felt mildly offended by it, imagine living inside a building where the alarm is a philosophy. The message was quiet but constant. Your past is unacceptable, and compliance is the new safety. Then there was language, which is both fragile and stubborn, like a thin thread that somehow holds a heavy quilt together. Language carries memory, jokes, prayers, family instructions, and the feeling of home in a single breath. That is exactly why it was targeted. Many schools punish children for speaking their mother tongues, training fear into the mouth and shame into the throat, as if the body itself could be taught to flinch at its own voice. Classrooms taught new words and also taught what not to say and when to swallow sound before it became trouble. Silence became a skill. Not the gentle silence of bedtime, but the trained silence of self-protection. Still, children whispered anyway under blankets, in corners, in moments where supervision couldn't fully reach. A language does not disappear neatly. It frays, it hides. It waits in the smallest spaces, the way a song can live in the back of your mind for years and then return, unexpectedly when you hear a familiar rhythm. You can picture those whispers as soft, almost like the whisper you're listening to now. But here in this room, the whisper is for comfort. In those hallways, the whisper was often for survival. And yet, even survival can look boring from a distance. A child passing a word to another child, quietly as if sharing a piece of candy that doesn't crinkle. A large part of school life was work, presented as training for the right kind of future, fields, laundries, kitchens, workshops, maintenance. The words themselves sound like a sleepy checklist, like chores written on a note and stuck to a refrigerator, and that was part of the disguise. Labor kept institutions running cheaply while teaching obedience through exhaustion and routine. It is difficult to question a system when you are tired enough to fall asleep standing up. The work had its own vocabulary, and it could be strangely specific. Laundry rooms had machines with names that sound almost whimsical until you imagine the heat and repetition. Mangles, wringers, boilers, vats, the sort of equipment that turns time into steam. Kitchens had endless peelings, endless stirring, endless scrubbing. Workshops had sanding, stitching, hammering, and repairs so small they could disappear into the day like dust in sunlight. You learn quickly what a system rewards: silence, speed, and becoming useful without asking why. Academic learning could be uneven or limited, depending on the school and the era, but discipline was thorough, because discipline was the deeper curriculum, not just rules, but habits. Not just schedules, but the sense that you should not belong to yourself. If you want a mildly absurd detail to hold on to, Consider that some institutions could be intensely serious about the angle of a bedspread or the shine on a shoe, as if the soul could be polished by turning leather into a mirror. A person's inner life is hard to measure. A shoe is easier. Punishment and harsh discipline were described by many survivors, along with humiliation and, in some cases, abuse experiences that did not belong to any school, but were allowed inside it. You don't need to picture those parts vividly tonight. You can let them remain at a respectful distance, like a closed file you acknowledge without opening. What matters, even in this quiet telling, is that harm can coexist with routine. It can sit beside the chalkboard and the timetable and pretend it as part of the lesson plan. And yet, under pressure, resistance existed in small, stubborn forms. Not grand speeches, not heroic escape scenes. Often just the thread of self kept intact. Hidden songs, shared food, protected stories, remembered names. The quiet decision to be kind to someone else when kindness was not budgeted for. Friendship became a shield. Care became a quiet rebellion. Even humor could survive in tiny doses, the way it does in any hard place, soft, dry, and sometimes aimed at the ridiculous seriousness of the rules. There is something almost painfully ordinary about that kind of resistance. It looks like a child saving a crumb, a child teaching another child a word, a child keeping a name alive in private, like a small candle cupped in both hands. If you've ever memorized a password you didn't choose, just because you had to, you already understand a small piece of it. Only here the password was a self, and the cost of forgetting it was too high. Time moved forward as it always does, and the records remained. The legacy is not only historical. It lives in families and interrupted language lines, in elders who carried memories like locked drawers. Today, archives, oral histories, and community work try to restore what was taken, especially names, stories, and the truth of what happened. Investigations have also focused on cemeteries and missing children, because institutions often recorded attendance more carefully than they honored loss. Paper was always good at counting. It was less interested in grieving. If you think about records, imagine the strange intimacy of a file. Someone's height, someone's behavior, someone's new name typed neatly on a page. The past can feel close and far at the same time, like reading a stranger's diary and realizing it is actually your own family's weather. Communities have spent years, sometimes generations, doing the slow work of finding what was buried, sometimes literally, sometimes in silence. Each recovered detail is small, a date, a photograph, a signature, a list, a name that returns to a family after being held in a drawer for decades. It is not a dramatic reversal. It is more like steady breathing, in, out, in, out. A system built to erase meets a community built to remember, and the remembering is patient because it has had to be. So if the story feels heavy, you can let it be heavy without turning it into spectacle. Respect is a form of quiet. Tonight, keep the facts in one jar: policies, routines, distances, and keep the human in another: voices, songs, the softness that survived. The point is not to end with a sharp moral, as if history were a bedtime fable with a tidy lesson. The point is to notice how much of power is made from ordinary motions: a form filled out, a bell rung, a rule enforced, a name rewritten, a language pushed into the shadows. And if you need a gentler thought to hold as you drift, let it be this: culture can be attacked, yes, but it can also return, carried home piece by piece, word by word, name by name, like a quilt slowly stitched back together after being cut apart. The train wheel keeps clicking. The scissors at last become just scissors again, metal and silence, not a symbol. The school bell fades into the distance where all bells eventually go. The night keeps listening, and somewhere, quietly, the names keep coming back. You might not expect a revolution to argue with a clock, but at a certain point in France, it did exactly that. Not with muskets, not with speeches, with a calm little decision that the day itself should be reorganized like a drawer full of mismatched socks. 10 hours, 100 minutes, 100 seconds. Time cleaned up. Time made sensible. Time politely told to stop being so 12-ish. And softly, before we wander into the gentle bureaucracy of it all, where and what time are you listening from? You don't have to answer. Just notice the room, the quiet. The way time right now is simply whatever your body says it is. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. The decimal system is very efficient, but it has never been proven to improve anyone's sleep. It mostly improves the confidence of people who like neat columns. The idea arrived the way many historical ideas do, on paper first, with tidy handwriting and the faint smell of certainty. The French Revolution didn't only want new laws and new leaders. It also wanted a new way of measuring everything that had previously been measured in ways that felt suspiciously medieval. So they made meters and liters and kilograms, and they put seriousness around it like a ribbon. And then, almost inevitably, they looked at time and thought, yes, you too. You look messy, you look inherited. You look like the church and the kings might have touched you. There is something strangely intimate about telling people how long an hour should be. An hour is not a physical object. You can't put it on a scale. You can't taste it to check quality. But you can redefine it. And that is the kind of power that makes committees feel warm inside. So committees discussed it. Mathematicians approved of it. Philosophers nodded at it. There's always someone in every era who sees a system and thinks, what if it were cleaner? The old day had 24 hours. The new day would have 10. Each hour would have 100 minutes. Each minute 100 seconds. It's almost soothing just to say it because it sounds like a spreadsheet. It sounds like a person who labels their cables. It sounds like someone who owns a little box for spare buttons. But the day does not actually become calmer when you rename its parts. It just becomes harder to complain accurately. I've had a long day stays true whether the day has 10 hours or 24. The only difference is that now you have to decide whether you're retired at the end of the 8th hour or the 19th. And either way, your body remains unimpressed by arithmetic. Still, in 1793, revolutionary France officially introduced decimal time. The details came with that particular revolutionary tone firm, rational, bright with the belief that reason could iron out centuries like a wrinkled shirt. If you could imagine a clock being handed a new identity card, that's the mood. The clock is told, gently but firmly, that it has been living incorrectly and must now improve itself. And because paper decisions eventually meet reality, someone had to build the clocks. Now we drift quietly from the meeting rooms into workshops that smell like oil, brass, and patient irritation. Watchmakers and clockmakers were skilled people, used to tiny tolerances and fussy gears, which meant they were exactly the wrong audience to casually announce, "Hello, please rebuild time." Their work was already a negotiation with friction and springs. Now it was also a negotiation with ideology. A decimal clock face could look familiar at first glance, hands going around. Numbers placed politely, but then you'd notice the wrongness. The way you notice a familiar song playing at the wrong speed. 10 hours around the dial. Maybe a second hand that felt overly enthusiastic. Maybe markings that made you squint. People like to think they notice history's big moments. But often, history's big moments are noticed as, why does my clock look slightly cursed? Some decimal clocks were made with 2 sets of markings because reality is always slipping little compromises into grand plans. You could have the old time and the new time together, like a bilingual sign in a train station that everyone pretends to read. There's something wonderfully human about that. Even in a moment obsessed with purity and reason, someone quietly thought, yes, but I still need to know when lunch is. And lunch, inconveniently, was not interested in being decimalized. Imagine a baker. The baker has a routine that was never designed by philosophers. The baker wakes when it's dark, works when it's still dark, and becomes fully awake exactly 1 minute after it is too late to go back to bed. Now the baker is told that the morning has been redefined. The sun rises at the same time, naturally, because the sun is famously uninterested in pamphlets. But the numbers describing that sunrise have changed. The baker is not delighted. The baker is quietly, deeply tired. This is where time reforms always become oddly personal. Not because anyone has strong emotional bonds with the number 12, but because routines are delicate structures, like nests. You touch them and they shift. People can learn new routines, yes. Humans adapt constantly, but adaptation is slower when the new routine is optional, confusing, and mildly annoying. So decimal time existed in a strange double world. In official language, it was clean and correct. In daily life, it had to compete with everything people already knew. It had to compete with bells that rang at familiar moments, with habits that lived in muscles, with the way noon feels like noon even if you rename it 5 o'clock. It also had to compete with the simple fact that most people do not want to do mental math while buying cheese. And then there's the quiet comedy of timekeeping tools. If you change the system, you must change the instruments, or at least pretend you can. New clocks were expensive. Old clocks were everywhere, and the old clocks did not politely resign. They kept ticking the old way, in kitchens, shops, churches, and bedrooms, like small mechanical conservatives. Some people tried to comply properly. They learned the new divisions, they used the new terms. They looked impressively serious about it. Other people simply nodded, said yes, and continued living inside the old numbers the moment the official left the room. This is not a moral judgment. It is just how humans behave when asked to reorganize something that was never broken in the first place, at least not from their perspective. If you've ever had a phone update that moved the button you liked to a place you didn't like, you already understand the vibe. You don't hate progress. You just want to stop thinking about where the button went. Decimal time demanded thought. Lots of it, quiet, tedious thought. The kind that drains you gently, like a slow leak. Now, without making anything dramatic, we can slide into the softly confusing middle period when a new time system tries to operate in a country full of old time. Shops had hours. Markets had routines. Appointments existed, even if they weren't always punctual in the modern sense. People used bells, sun position, habit, and the general feeling of it's probably late enough. Decimal time wanted precision. Daily life wanted comfort. Official documents could use decimal time. Scientific-minded people liked it. It had a crispness to it, like freshly laundered linen. But if you told someone to meet you at 7.30, you had created a gentle problem. Was that old time or new time? Was it 7.5 decimal hours, which would sound normal but feel wrong? Or was it 7:30 in the old sense, which is a different slice of day entirely? Both answers could be defended. Both answers could also lead to you standing alone somewhere, trying to look philosophical about it. And this is where micro-absurdities live, the kind that history rarely celebrates, but daily life definitely notices. A clock face that makes visitors stare too long. A pamphlet explaining decimal minutes to people who are mostly trying to carry potatoes. A person who becomes oddly proud of understanding the system, the way someone becomes proud of knowing a niche keyboard shortcut. A neighbor who says it's the 5th hour, and another neighbor who replies, yes, but what does that mean in real life? The revolution loved renaming things. Months were renamed, festivals were reorganized. Time itself was invited to the makeover. It's almost sweet in a way, this belief that the world could be made more rational by rearranging its labels. But the older you get, the more you realize labels are mostly helpful when everyone agrees on them. Otherwise, they become decorative, like a sign that says, welcome on a door nobody uses. So decimal time did what many ambitious reforms do. It existed, it tried, it impressed certain people. It confused many people, and then it slowly began to fade, not with a dramatic decree that everyone cheered, more like a quiet loss of momentum, less like a revolution, more like a hobby being abandoned. By 1795, decimal time was officially suspended. The old 24-hour day returned to the center, as if it had been waiting patiently in the hallway, hands folded, not taking it personally. This is not because decimal time was mathematically wrong. It was perfectly consistent. That was part of the problem. Consistency is lovely on paper. Life is not always interested in consistency. Life is interested in, does it work without me thinking too hard? But the objects remained. Some decimal clocks survived because objects have their own stubborn afterlives. They became curiosities. They became collector's items. They became conversation starters in rooms where people like to talk softly about mechanisms. Somewhere, a decimal clock sat on a mantelpiece and continued being 10 base, even though everyone around it had moved on. It ticked like a small mechanical poem about human ambition. And if you want a gently pointless detail to tuck into your mind, consider the simple fact that you could own a decimal clock and never actually use decimal time. You could just enjoy the way it looks, the way its numbers sit there calmly wrong, the way it implies an alternate world where everyone agreed to do the extra math and somehow liked it. It's comforting in an odd way that time reforms can fail, not because failure is wonderful, but because it reminds you that not everything can be forced into neatness. The day keeps arriving, indifferent. The sun keeps rising without checking the official calendar. People keep getting hungry at times that feel right, not times that are perfectly subdivided. And the clock, whether it has 10 hours or 24, keeps doing what clocks do, moving forward in tiny steps, pretending it understands you. So tonight, as you listen, you don't need to decide whether you prefer 10 hours or 24. You don't need to be loyal to any system. You can just let the minutes, whatever they're called, softly pass. You can imagine a workshop lamp shining on brass gears. You can imagine a committee feeling proud of a clean chart. You can imagine a baker quietly ignoring the entire concept and returning to the oven. And then, in the safest, calmest way, you can let time become what it really is at bedtime. Not a measurement, not a debate, not a reform, but a slow, steady drifting. A clock hand moving. A breath in for 4, out for 6. The faint tick of something mechanical in the distance. The gentle truth that the day will be whatever it will be, whether you count it in 10s or 12s. And you don't have to do any arithmetic at all to fall asleep. You might not expect a nation to try to solve difference with scissors, paperwork, and a train schedule, but that was, for a long time, treated as a perfectly reasonable administrative project, not dramatic, not shouted, just filed. A wheel clicks under a carriage. A pair of scissors makes that soft, impatient whisper near an ear. A school bell rings and then almost politely holds its breath. And somewhere in all that ordinary sound, someone decides that childhood is a material that can be reshaped like damp cloth on a frame. Where and what time are you listening from? You don't have to answer. Just let the room stay the room. Let the air do its quiet work. Breathe in for 4, out for 6, and notice how even a heavy topic can be approached the way a librarian approaches a fragile book. Slowly, carefully, without theatrics, because the details are already enough. If you are still awake by the time we reach the part where forms get stamped and names get simplified, you can subscribe. Or don't. This is not an urgent request. It is more like leaving a bookmark somewhere and trusting you'll find it again when you feel like it, possibly after a nap. A lot of this begins the way institutions like to begin, with a sentence that sounds clean, a slogan that sounds like policy. In the United States and Canada, the The boarding school project was often justified with language about civilizing, education, improvement, and other words that sound friendly when they sit alone on a page. The page is a powerful place for friendly words because the page doesn't show the cost of them. The page can stay calm while the world does something else entirely. And once a phrase becomes official enough, it starts acting like a blueprint. It teaches people what is allowed to be done and how to describe it afterwards so it doesn't sound like harm. The truly strange thing about bureaucratic harm is how tidy it can be. A rule can be written with perfect grammar. A policy can be typed in neat lines. A signature can be elegant. And that elegance can sit right on top of cruelty without disturbing it, the way a lace tablecloth sits on a hard table. The rules could cover clothing, hair, posture, religion, language, and even the correct angle of a smile. Not because someone was deeply interested in joy, but because control likes completeness. Control likes to reach into the small places. It likes to say, even your face should be standard, and then comes the distance. Distance does a lot of the work. The removal of children was not always a single dramatic raid the way movies like to show it. Sometimes it was pressure, sometimes it was promises, sometimes it was the slow tightening of options until choice becomes a word you say out loud, even when it isn't fully true. A child leaves home on a road that feels ordinary: wheels, dust, a ticket, maybe a tag with a name, and the ordinary road becomes a door that closes behind them. Letters become controlled. Visits become rare. The space between home and school becomes a kind of fog where grief can be ignored by people who do not have to live inside it. If you picture it gently, you can almost see the system's preference for routines. Routines are easier to manage than emotions. A timetable doesn't argue. A bell doesn't ask why. A list of names doesn't cry. In an institutional mind, a child's world can shrink into wake, line up, eat, work, sleep, repeat. The repetition is the point. Repetition wears down what is specific. It smooths edges. It turns a living identity into something that can be handled like inventory. It is the opposite of a story arc. It is an endless loop, quiet, efficient, and exhausting. When the child arrives, the transformation begins with the kind of actions that look small, almost silly, if you try to describe them without context. Haircut, clothes replaced, personal items removed or standardized, bodies arranged into sameness, so difference becomes easy to spot and correct. Names changed or shortened, sometimes to something the school could pronounce, sometimes to something the school could record, sometimes to something that fit the school's sense of order. It's hard to explain how much a name holds until someone else decides it is inconvenient. Uniforms are another form of quiet mathematics. A uniform says, you are now part of a set. It makes the person look orderly, which is a word that sounds like virtue. But it also makes the person interchangeable. If individuality is a problem to be solved, then sameness becomes the solution. And the strange part is how calmly this can be presented. The message is rarely screamed. It is delivered in the daily normal tone of institutions. This is how we do things here. Your past is unacceptable. Compliance is the new safety. The softest voice can carry the hardest instruction. Language, meanwhile, is targeted not because it is loud, but because it is intimate. Language carries memory, jokes, prayers, family instructions, and the feeling of home inside a single breath. It is the most portable homeland a person owns, which is exactly why institutions trying to erase identity focus on it. Many survivors describe punishment for speaking their mother tongues, punishments that train fear into the mouth and shame into the throat. And so you get a classroom where new words are taught, but also a larger lesson: what not to say, and when to swallow sound before it becomes trouble. Still, language is stubborn in small ways. Children whisper anyway. Under blankets, in kitchens, in corners where supervision doesn't reach fully. A whispered word is not a rebellion with banners. It is something smaller and more human, proof that memory can live quietly. Sometimes resistance is simply refusing to let the inside of your mind be fully colonized by the schedule. Now the days move into the long middle of school life, where the institution tries to justify itself by calling work education. A large part of boarding school life involved labor fields, laundries, kitchens, workshops, maintenance. Work that kept the institution running cheaply, while also teaching obedience through exhaustion and routine. This is one of the odd ironies of institutional uplift. It often depends on the labor of the people being improved, as if the lesson is less about learning and more about becoming useful without asking why. You can imagine the repetitive tasks because repetition is what makes them feel sleepy in description, even when the reality was not sleepy at all. Laundry done in batches because everything in institutions happens in batches. Floors scrubbed until the motion becomes automatic. Peeling potatoes in long, quiet lines where the only excitement is whether the knife is dull. Sewing, mending, chopping wood, washing dishes, tending livestock. The kind of work that, in any other context, might be simply part of family life, except here it is extracted as discipline, measured as compliance, and used to shape a child into something the school can approve of. Academic learning could be uneven or limited, depending on the school, the era, and the philosophy of the administrators, but discipline was thorough. Discipline tends to be thorough because it is easier to standardize than curiosity. Curiosity has too many directions. Discipline has one direction, and so the child learns quickly what the system rewards: silence, speed, neatness, and the ability to become invisible unless asked to perform. Punishment sits nearby like an extra piece of furniture in the room. Many survivors describe harsh discipline and humiliation, and some speak of abuse experiences that do not belong to any school but were allowed to live inside these schools anyway. This is where it matters to keep the tone quiet without making it casual. A calm voice is not the same as a dismissive one. The history can be spoken softly and still be true. The harm does not need dramatic music. It only needs the record of what happened and the refusal to pretend it was normal. And yet, even in pressured systems, humans make small, stubborn shelters. Resistance exists in forms that are almost boring if you list them, which is part of why institutions underestimate them. A hidden song, shared food, protected stories, remembered names, friendship that becomes a shield, care that becomes a quiet rebellion, kindness offered where policy never budgeted for it. Sometimes the greatest resistance is simply surviving while keeping any thread of self intact, like holding onto a tiny piece of string through a storm and telling yourself it still counts. If you want a gentle modern analogy, think of how a phone can be locked down with restrictions, but people still find ways to send messages through games, through shared accounts, through little loopholes no one expected. Now replace the phone with a human life, and replace the loophole with a whispered language, and you can feel faintly how persistence works when it has to live quietly. After the long middle comes what remains, which is not a neat ending but a scattered set of objects, records, graves, returned names, interrupted language lines, elders who carried memories like locked drawers. The legacy is historical, yes, but it is also present. Archives exist. Oral histories exist. Community work exists. Investigations exist. And sometimes the most painful part is that institutions recorded attendance more carefully than they honored loss. Paperwork was often meticulous about who was present, and less interested in who was missing, as if the ledger could replace the person. Some investigations focus on cemeteries and missing children, because the physical world keeps receipts even when governments avoid them. A grave is a record in dirt. A name on a list is a record in ink. And sometimes the hard work of communities is to bring these records into alignment again, to match the ink with the earth. to return a name to a family, to make the past speak clearly enough that it cannot be politely ignored. There is also a quieter kind of return, language returning in small lessons at kitchen tables, stories returning in community gatherings, songs returning in careful voices that tremble not because they are weak, but because they are carrying weight. Not every return is complete. Some losses remain losses. But recovery can happen in fragments, and fragments can still be real. A system built to erase meets a community built to remember, and the collision is slow, practical, and full of patient work. If the story feels too heavy, it is allowed to be heavy without becoming spectacle. Respect can be quiet. Truth can be quiet. Even accountability can be quiet in the sense that it does not need shouting to exist. It needs persistence, documents, testimonies, and the stubborn refusal to let everything drift into vague, long-ago fog. And in the middle of all that, there is a gentle, almost paradoxical bedtime lesson. Sometimes the most enormous historical forces express themselves through the smallest repeated action spells, schedules, haircuts, forms, and the simple, relentless idea that someone else should decide who you are. So very softly now, you can keep the facts in one jar policies, routines, distances, trains, registers, and keep the human in another voices, songs, the softness that survived. You can let your mind notice the ordinary sounds again, the imagined train wheel clicking into the dark, the school bell fading, the scissors finally put down on a table. And you can let the ending be what history often is in real life. Not a clean conclusion, but a slow continuation. The night keeps listening. The paper keeps its ink. The names and time keep coming back. You might not expect a government to run cultural change the way it runs a post office, by schedule, by form, by quiet repetition, but that was, for a long time, considered the sensible method. A train wheel clicks, not loudly, just steadily, like a metronome that never studied music. Somewhere nearby, scissors make that soft, papery whisper, the kind of sound that feels harmless until you remember what scissors are for. A school bell rings, and then, almost theatrically, decides to stop ringing and let the silence do the rest. Where and what time are you listening from? You don't have to answer. Just notice your room. Notice the weight of the air. Breathe in for 4, out for 6. And let your mind do what it does best at night. Drift toward details that are strangely specific, oddly procedural, and a little too confident for their own good. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe. Or don't. I'm saying it the way an institution would say it, calmly, without follow-up, and with the quiet assumption that the paperwork will proceed either way. This episode sits in a place where history is not charming, but it is undeniably real, and it matters how we hold it. So we'll keep the tone soft without turning anything into spectacle. The facts can be heavy without being loud. The past can be described without being performed. And the strange, unsettling thing we all keep coming back to is how much harm can be delivered in tidy sentences, signed forms, stamped approvals, neat little rules that behave as if they're just organizing a drawer. The phrase, "kill the Indian, save the man," is one of those sentences that refuses to become harmless with time. It was not just rhetoric, it was a design. A sentence that tried to become a procedure. When policy takes a slogan seriously, it starts building buildings, it starts hiring staff, it starts printing manuals, it starts treating children like raw material, as if identity were a messy substance that could be trimmed, washed, pressed, and folded into something more acceptable. That word acceptable does a lot of work in administrative history. It sounds polite. It sounds like a standard you can meet. It also quietly implies that someone else gets to set the standard. Officials framed removal as education, and sometimes insisted it was even benevolent. That's one of the tricks of institutional language. It can make almost anything sound like improvement if you say it slowly enough. But the goal often leaned toward cultural erasure. Change the child, and the community weakens on its own. It is a strategy that avoids open conflict by aiming at continuity language lines, names, ceremonies, the small daily habits that keep a people recognizable to themselves. It is not a plan built for a single dramatic moment. It is built for time. Time is the tool, time is the pressure, and the rules were written with calm authority. Dress, language, religion, posture, hair, even the correct way to smile on command. A smile on command is a fascinating concept if you think about it the way a sleepy historian might. It is the moment a face becomes a uniform. It's the moment a person's expression is treated like a button to be pressed. The institution does not need you to feel joy. It needs you to display something it can interpret as compliance. Breathe in for 4, out for 6, and notice how easily order can be mistaken for good. The separation itself often began with pressure, promises, or force, and ended with a child moving away from home in a way that could look deceptively ordinary from a distance. There is the road. There is the ticket. There is the official who knows which line to sign. And there is the family left standing in the place where the child used to be, staring at a space that is suddenly too quiet. Distance does a lot of the system's work. Distance makes visits rare. Distance makes letters easier to control. Distance makes grief easier for outsiders to ignore, because grief is inconvenient when it arrives without an appointment. A child's world could shrink from a living community to a timetable, wake, line, up, eat, work, sleep, repeat. The repetition becomes a kind of weather. Not dramatic weather, no thunder, no lightning, just the steady drizzle of routine. And in that repeat, the system hoped the old self would fade the way a language fades when it is unspoken aloud. Not instantly, quietly, over months, over years. Over the kind of time that is very good at wearing down anything that needs care. Arrival often meant immediate transformation. The kind of transformation that sounds almost silly when listed plainly, which is part of why institutions could pretend it was minor. Haircut. Clothes replaced, personal items removed. Bodies arranged into sameness so difference could be treated like a mistake. Names changed or simplified, turned into something the school could pronounce, record, and control. That last word, control, is the hidden backbone of many civilizing projects. It's not always shouted, but it is present in every little decision. Who gets to speak? Who gets to choose? Who gets to keep their own meaning? Uniforms made children look orderly, and orderliness is the kind of thing administrators love because it photographs well and reports well. Orderliness is also the easiest quality to confuse with safety. The uniform says, I belong here. It can also quietly say, I have been made interchangeable. When individuality becomes inconvenient, sameness becomes the solution. The message is rarely delivered with melodrama. It arrives like a daily announcement. Your past is unacceptable, and compliance is the new safety. Language was targeted because it carries memory in a compact form. A joke in a mother tongue can contain an entire worldview. A prayer can carry a family shape. A single familiar word can make a room feel like home, even if the room is not home at all. So many schools punish children for speaking their languages, training fear into the mouth and shame into the throat. The classroom taught new words, yes, but it also taught what not to say and when to swallow sound before it became trouble. And yet, language is stubborn. Children whispered anyway, under blankets, in kitchens, in the small spaces where supervision couldn't fully reach. Whispered words are not loud rebellion. They are something quieter, proof that memory can survive in a pocket. Sometimes resistance is just that, keeping one thread of self intact, even when everything else is being rearranged. Then comes the long, sleepy monotony of institutional life, where work is presented as education. A large part of boarding school life was labor fields. Laundries, kitchens, workshops, maintenance. Work kept institutions running cheaply while also teaching obedience through exhaustion and routine. This is one of those historical ironies that is almost too consistent across different places and centuries. Systems that claim to improve people often rely heavily on the labor of the people being improved. It's like being assigned homework that mostly benefits the teacher's garden. The tasks themselves could be endlessly repetitive. Laundry done in batches because institutions love batches. Floors scrubbed until the movement becomes automatic. Vegetables peeled in long lines where the most exciting event is discovering the knife is dull again. Sewing, mending, chopping, carrying, cleaning. Ordinary work becomes extraordinary only because it is used as a tool of shaping. The child learns what the system rewards: silence, speed, neatness, usefulness without questions. Curiosity is rarely rewarded in systems that depend on predictability. Discipline was thorough. Discipline is often more thorough than education because discipline is easier to standardize. You can standardize rules. You can standardize punishments. You can standardize silence. Learning, on the other hand, has too many directions, and it keeps producing opinions, which are notoriously difficult to file. Many survivors describe harsh discipline and humiliation, and some speak of abuse. It matters to say this without turning it into a performance, because these experiences are not narrative devices. They are the cost of a system that treated children as objects to be processed. The quietest cruelty is sometimes the one that hides inside normal. The bell rings, the schedule continues, the paperwork stays neat, and harm is allowed to exist as if it were just another line item. Yet, even in pressure, people create small shelters. Resistance existed in forms so small they can look almost boring on paper, which is part of why institutions underestimated them. Hidden songs, shared food, projected stories, remembered names, friendship as a shield, care as a quiet rebellion. Kindness offered where the policy never budgeted for kindness. The greatest resistance was often simply surviving while keeping any thread of self intact, like a thin piece of string held quietly in a closed fist. Now, after all the routine and repetition, we arrive at what remains. Not a clean ending, not a satisfying wrap-up. History rarely gives those. What remains is a scattered set of objects and efforts, records, graves, returning names, interrupted language lines, elders who carried memories like locked drawers. Archives exist. Oral histories exist. Community work exists. Investigations exist. And one of the bleakly practical details is that institutions often recorded attendance more carefully than they honored loss. Paperwork can be meticulous about who is present and oddly indifferent about who is missing. Some investigations focus on cemeteries and missing children because the physical world keeps receipts even when official narratives try to blur them. A grave is a record in earth. A name is a record in ink. And sometimes the work of communities is to bring those records closer together again, to return names to families, to reconnect stories that were cut on purpose, to make the past speak clearly enough that it cannot be politely ignored. There's also a quieter kind of return that happens in living rooms and community centers and language classes. A word returns. A song returns. A story returns, not always whole. Sometimes only in fragments, but fragments still matter. Recovery can be slow and practical, like mending fabric rather than replacing it. And in that slow work, something becomes clear. A system built to erase eventually meets a community built to remember. The system is efficient. The community is patient. Patience over time can be more powerful than efficiency, even if it does not look impressive on paper. So, very softly now, we can keep the facts in one jar: policies, routines, distances, trains, registers, and keep the human in another: voices, songs, the softness that survived. We can let the tone stay calm without pretending anything was harmless. We can let the room be quiet again. The train wheel keeps clicking in the dark, steady and indifferent. The scissors are set down finally. The bell fades until it becomes just a memory of sound. And the night keeps listening, not for a dramatic conclusion, but for the slow, persistent return of names coming back in their own time, in their own voices, as gently as a whisper that refuses to disappear. You might not expect the most secret part of a nation as communication to be the part that failed, gently, over and over again. Not the triumphant deliveries, not the romantic letters arriving on time, but the letters that didn't arrive at all, the ones that wandered into the wrong street, the wrong town, the wrong spelling, and then came to rest in a quiet room where people were paid to be calmly curious about other people's handwriting. A paper world has to have a place for paper that goes nowhere. And in the 19th century in Britain, that place had a name that sounds like it was invented by a tired poet who also kept receipts: the dead letter office. Cold open, very small sounds. A pen scratches. A wax seal creaks as it cools. A stack of envelopes settles with that soft sigh paper makes when it gives up its last bit of stiffness. Somewhere far away, a sorting bell taps once, as if to remind everyone that time is made of little taps. Whisper where and what time are you listening from? You don't have to answer. Just let the question sit quietly on the edge of your mind, like an unopened envelope you'll never quite get around to, because sleep is more important than being organized. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part about misaddressed parcels and suspiciously heavy packages containing possibly a single boot, feel free to subscribe. But honestly, don't strain yourself. The dead letter office will keep running either way. That's the whole point of bureaucracies. They continue. The modern world likes to imagine the mail as a straight line. Sender to recipient, neatly, efficiently, with a little beep in the tracking app to reassure us that the universe has not forgotten our existence. But old mail was a more human creature. It wandered. It got confused. It was sent to Mr. John near the Big Oak. It was addressed to someone who had moved, or died, or never existed in the first place except as a hopeful guess. It arrived damp. It arrived torn. It arrived beautifully sealed and then tragically unclaimed. And when enough of these accumulated, the state did what the state always does when confronted with a messy pile. It built a system and gave the system a desk. In Britain, the story becomes especially neat after the introduction of the penny post in 1840, when sending a letter became cheaper and much more common, and the volume of mail swelled into something that looked, from the right angle, like a national hobby. With more letters came more mistakes because humans are generous with emotion and careless with spelling. Addresses were written in haste and grief and excitement in the dim light of kitchens. Town names were abbreviated into private shorthand. Street numbers were guessed. And sometimes the address was simply wrong in a way that felt personal, as if the sender had lost not just a location, but a whole map of reality. So the system needed rules. Calm rules, boring rules, the kind of rules that sound like they're about order, but are also, quietly, about power. A dead letter is not just an undelivered letter. It is a letter that has been captured by procedure. It becomes an object that belongs, temporarily, to the state. And that state has to decide what to do with it without looking too interested, because looking interested would be rude and also inconveniently suspicious. Breathe in for 4, out for 6. Notice how the most intrusive actions can be made to feel polite if they are performed slowly and with paperwork. The dead letter office, in its various forms over time, operated like a small, hushed afterlife for correspondence. Letters came in from sorting centers when they could not be delivered and could not be returned. Some had no return address. Some were addressed to Miss Annie, the pretty one, which is not a legal location no matter how confidently it is written. Some were stained, burnt at the edge, chewed by something small and determined. They arrived in bundles, and the bundles became routines. Register, Examine, attempt to identify, attempt to return, and only if necessary, open. Opening someone else's letter is one of those actions that feels morally loud, even when done quietly. So the office wrapped the act in rules like soft cloth. Letters were open only under certain conditions. They were opened by authorized clerks. Contents were handled with care. Valuable enclosures, money, jewelry, promissory notes, sometimes even tiny rings wrapped in paper had to be recorded. The point was not to read people's love stories for entertainment, though you can't fully prevent a human brain from noticing things once the paper is open. The point officially was to find clues, a second address, a recognizable name, a hint that could turn a dead letter back into a living one, and if you picture this, picture it as gently as possible. Not a dramatic scene, just a room, just desks. Just men and women in work clothes that look like the uniform of patients. Just a pile of mysteries that are mostly not mysterious at all, just misdirection, bad handwriting, and the human habit of assuming someone else knows what you mean. There's something almost sweetly absurd about the kind of clues people left without realizing. A letter might contain nothing but a few lines and a pressed flower, and yet the pressed flower becomes, in a clerk's mind, a possible identifier, because clerks have to make meaning from scraps. A letter might mention, casually, "Tell mother I found work near the docks," and suddenly the clerk is thinking about docks, and which docks, and how many towns have docks, and whether mother is a person or an entire category of women who have, unfortunately, given birth. Sometimes the contents were oddly practical. Receipts, lists, measurements, a note about a borrowed saucepan. People have always used mail for things that do not sound romantic. People have always been both dramatic and mundane. A letter can contain grief, and in the next line, a request for socks. Every so often, there were parcels. These were the most tempting and the most troublesome, because a parcel is essentially an envelope that decided it wanted more attention. Parcels could contain valuables. Parcels could contain food, which is a terrible idea if it gets stuck in transit, but humans have never been famous for resisting terrible ideas. Parcels could contain objects that raise gentle questions, like a single shoe, or a set of false teeth, or a lock of hair tied neatly with string. It is hard to be completely bored by a parcel containing one boot. It is also hard to be surprised by it once you accept that human life is full of single boots. The office had to be careful with money. Cash could be returned if an owner could be identified. If not, it was recorded and handled according to policy. Coins and notes are wonderfully indifferent to sentiment. They do not care whether they were sent in love or panic. They just sit there, waiting to be counted, like they've always wanted to be part of a spreadsheet. And then there are the really ordinary tragedies. Letters addressed to people who had died. Letters that arrived too late. Letters that were written with urgency, but delivered into a system that had no concept of urgency, only sequence. The dead letter office was not built to weep. It was built to process. But processing does not erase the quiet fact that many letters were never meant to be read by anyone else, and many were never read by the person they were meant for at all. Still, the office kept doing what offices do. It tried again. It checked directories. It compared handwriting. It consulted lists. It asked other departments. It was, in its own way, the national version of you checking your contacts list for John maybe who works near the docks, and then realizing you have 7 Johns and none of them are helpful. The difference is that the office had ledgers, and you have a phone, and both of you, in the end, are just trying to match a name to a location without losing your patience. The labor itself was very procedural. Letters were logged, packages were cataloged, enclosures were noted. There were forms for forms. There were signatures confirming that a letter had been opened properly, which is the kind of sentence that sounds silly until you realize that properly is where the entire moral argument hides. Properly means with authorization. Properly means with witnesses. Properly means you can later say, we did nothing wrong, while doing something that would feel wrong without the paperwork. Clerks develop skills that sound like party tricks, but are actually just survival in a paper world. They learn to read bad handwriting the way some people learn to read weather. They learned regional patterns in addresses. They learned that a smudge could turn Bath into both, and both is not a town no matter how optimistic you are. They learned that people write faster when emotional, and faster writing makes the letter more likely to die, which is a cruel little loop. Feeling makes you hurry, hurry makes you unclear, being unclear makes you lost. To keep themselves awake, some clerks probably formed private jokes. Not cruel jokes, we can hope. Just the kind of tired humor any repetitive workplace produces. The near the big oak letter, the one addressed to the nice man with the hat, the one that says, essentially, you know who you are, which is a lovely sentiment and a dreadful address. Bureaucracies collect human vagueness like lint, and yet there was also care. Not sentimental care, but carefulness. Letters were not supposed to be casually destroyed. Many were stored. Some were eventually returned. Some were forwarded after a clue was found. And some, after all reasonable attempts, were treated as truly dead, which meant they entered the final category of bureaucracy: disposal, auction, destruction, or retention for official reasons. Even the afterlife has filing cabinets. What remains if you step back is a strange archive of ordinary life. Dead letters are a record of what people thought was important enough to send. They reveal the shape of a day, who needed money, who needed news, who needed reassurance, who wanted to share a small detail about weather or work. They also reveal the limits of human systems. A nation can build railways and sorting centers and standardize postage, but it cannot standardize the human impulse to write near the big oak and trust that the universe will do the rest. In a modern analogy, the dead letter office is the customer support inbox of the 19th century, except instead of I forgot my password, it's I forgot how to locate my cousin, and instead of a ticket number, it's a physical object that smells faintly of smoke or soap or a kitchen where someone wrote quickly before the lamp went out. The quiet comedy is that both systems, old and new, are built around the same hope that somewhere in the mess, there is enough information to make things go where they are supposed to go. Sometimes the information is there. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the system succeeds. Sometimes it fails. The mail is a lesson in humility, delivered in envelopes. And now, very gently, we can hold a small bedtime oath for paper history. Keep the facts in one jar: postage reform, sorting routines, ledgers, sealing wax, the rules for opening letters, and keep the human in another: misspellings, longing, small, domestic requests, the stubborn tenderness of people trying to reach each other through ink and distance. If the story feels too full, let it be full without forcing it into drama. Respect can be quiet. Breathe in for 4, out for 6. Imagine the room where the dead letters waited. Not haunted, just still. A desk lamp. A stack of envelopes. A clerk turning a letter over once, then twice, looking for a return address like it might appear out of politeness. A seal that must be broken with care. A name that might be familiar to someone, somewhere, if only the world were slightly more coordinated. The pen scratches again. The paper settles. The sorting bell taps once more, not to announce an ending, but to keep time moving forward in small, manageable sounds. And if you let your mind drift, you can drift with it, past the addresses, past the ink, past the careful rules, into a soft, unimportant quiet, where the only thing that matters is that the system kept trying and the night, as usual, keeps listening. You might not expect one of the most carefully organized services in the ancient world to involve, quite politely, a bucket of old urine. Not fresh, not dramatic. Just the kind that has had time to sit somewhere warm and become, against its will, useful. And yet, if you wandered into certain Roman streets at the right hour, you would have found a business built on exactly that quiet chemical patience, the laundry. Cold open, very small sounds, sandals scuff on stone. A wooden mallet taps a cloth against a bench. A shallow vat makes a soft, reluctant slosh. Somewhere nearby, a donkey shifts its weight, because even donkeys can sense when an empire is doing something slightly odd in the name of cleanliness. Whisper where and what time are you listening from? You don't have to answer. Just let the question rest beside you, like a folded linen tunic on a chair, waiting for a day that doesn't need to happen right now. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part where the Roman state notices the money potential of public urinals, you can subscribe if you want. Or don't. The laundry will keep going either way, because it has always been a place where the world's mess gets turned into something wearable again. And that work does not pause for anyone's attention span. In modern life, laundry is a small domestic ritual. You sort colors with the seriousness of a judge. You stare at a washing machine window as if it contains wisdom. You buy detergent that promises ocean breeze, which is brave, because the ocean itself rarely smells like it's trying to impress you. But in Rome, laundry could be a public industry, a neighborhood service, and sometimes a surprisingly social place. People wore woolen togas and tunics that needed cleaning, brightening, and finishing, and they did not always have the time, space, or water to do it all at home. So they brought their clothes to specialists. These specialists were called foolers, and their workshops were called fulanicae. Even the word sounds like it's busy. A fulanica was not a quiet little shop with a bell on the door and a single polite clerk. It could be a bustling workspace with vats, basins, presses, drying racks, and workers moving in a rhythm that made the whole operation feel like a slow, damp orchestra. And the goal was simple, in the way most goals are simple until you try to achieve them. Take dirty cloth and make it clean, presentable, and ideally more impressive than it was before. The earliest step was cleaning, removing oils, sweat, and whatever else a person might collect while being alive in a city. Romans used water, of course, and soaps or soaps-like materials existed. But the famous ingredient, the one that makes modern listeners blink and then pretend they didn't hear it, was urine. Specifically, stale urine, because the chemistry becomes more effective as it breaks down and releases ammonia. It is, in its own calm way, a reminder that nature is constantly doing work you didn't ask for. Workers would pour or ladle the liquid into shallow vats and add cloth. And then, with a kind of practical resignation, they would stomp. Not angrily, not theatrically, just repeatedly. If you want a gentle image, imagine it like slow dancing, except you are dancing with laundry, and the music is the sound of an empire pretending this is normal because it is normal, because everyone wants their clothes back by tomorrow. Breathe in for 4, out for 6. Notice how even the oddest human practices become soothing when they are described as routine. After the cloth had been worked and rinsed, there were further steps: whitening, finishing, pressing, brushing. Some fulanicae use substances like fuller's earth, a clay that can absorb oils, and various treatments for brightening fabric. The details could vary, and the technology was not a single universal Roman machine, but a patchwork of methods that worked well enough that people kept paying for them. That's how you know something is effective, not because it is elegant, but because it survives. And then there is the slightly philosophical part. Laundry is not just cleaning. Laundry is restoring social order. Clothing in Rome was intensely social. Your toga and its cleanliness were part of your public face. Stains were not just stains, they were signals. A bright, well-finished garment suggested stability, respectability, and the comforting implication that you had enough resources to care about appearance. A dingy toga suggested other things. It suggested that you either had been working or had not been cared for, or had been too busy or too poor or too indifferent. And in a society that loved categories, indifference could be interpreted as its own kind of crime. So the Fuller's shop became a small institution of public presentation. It took the raw material of daily life, dust, sweat, food splashes, and the general drift of city living, and returned a version of the wearer that looked slightly more controlled. It was, in a way, an early service industry for anxiety. You could pay someone to make you look like you had things under control, even if your actual life was mostly held together by hope and the occasional coin. The yearning itself had to come from somewhere, and this is where Rome, with its gift turning everything into a system, becomes quietly impressive. Public latrines existed, and so did public urinals, and there were containers placed in streets where people could contribute. There is something almost democratic about it, in a strange, sideways way. Everyone produces. Everyone can, unintentionally, supply the laundry industry. You can imagine the containers sitting there like silent civic volunteers, collecting the raw material of cleanliness. Of course, when something becomes useful at scale, the state eventually notices. In the reign of Emperor Vespasian, the story goes, a tax was placed on urine collected from public urinals because if you can monetize something, why wouldn't you, especially when the empire always has expenses? The tax is remembered through an anecdote. Vespasian's son reportedly objected to the idea of taxing urine, and Vespasian held up a coin and asked whether it smelled. The point, delivered with the calm bluntness of a man who has seen too many budgets, was that money does not carry the odor of its origin, and thus we get the phrase often translated as money does not stink. It's a soothingly cynical idea, and also a very practical one. Empires run on money. Toilets produce a steady supply of something taxable, and laundry, as always, needs materials. So the system linked bodily routine to financial routine, and both were treated as normal, because calling something normal is sometimes the easiest way to make it stay. If you're noticing a theme, it's this. The truly enduring human systems are the ones that deal with unglamorous realities. Roads are glamorous, in a way. Aqueducts are glamorous. But the daily movement of waste and the daily restoration of clothes are the kinds of things that keep a city functioning without anyone writing poems about them. Or, if poems are written, they are usually not read aloud at dinner. And yet, there is a quiet beauty in the rhythm. Imagine a Roman morning with the city waking, shops opening, bread being carried in baskets. Somewhere, a fuller's workshop is already active. Cloth is soaking, being worked, being rinsed. Water runs through basins. Workers talk or don't. A customer arrives and explains with elaborate seriousness that this garment must be cleaned by a certain day because there is an event, and events have rules. The fuller nods the way service workers have always nodded, which is to say, with a polite expression that contains a lifetime of hearing the same urgency dressed up as uniqueness. There are also little technical details that make the whole thing feel more real. In some excavated Philonike, archaeologists have found rows of vats set into the floor and pressing equipment that suggests finishing steps beyond simple washing. You can picture garments being placed under presses to squeeze water out, to flatten, to shape. You can picture the careful brushing of wool to restore a smooth surface. You can picture sunlight used as a tool because sunlight has always been one of humanity's favorite free services. If you want a modern comparison, the fuller's workshop is part laundromat, part dry cleaner, part textile finishing studio. It's also quietly part social reassurance factory. You bring chaos in, you receive order back. And yes, the order smells better than the chaos, even if the process involved some ingredients you would rather not think about too clearly. The workers themselves are easy to forget in the glossy idea of Roman life, which often focuses on senators and soldiers and marble. But most Roman life was labor. The fullers were part of the urban economy, and their work could be physically demanding and repetitive. Stomping cloth is not a glamorous fitness routine. It is the kind of motion that tells you exactly how much time exists in a workday. And yet, these workers were essential. Without them, the clean white toga becomes less common, the public image of the elite becomes harder to maintain, and the city looks slightly more like a city actually looks: messy, human, and perfect. Rome's obsession with order wasn't only about laws and armies. It was also about surfaces, clean surfaces, presentable surfaces, the surfaces of walls, the surfaces of public spaces, and the surfaces of people. A cleaner garment could be a small symbol that the world was, at least in this corner, manageable. Even if the sky was smoky sometimes, even if politics was loud, even if the street was full of dust, the toga could come back bright, and that brightness could stand in briefly for a sense of control. And then, after all of that, there's the quiet end of the process. The customer returns. The garment is handed over. Coins change hands. The customer leaves wearing something that feels fresh, or at least less lived in. The workshop continues. Another garment enters the cycle. Another person's public self is restored. No applause, no speeches. Just the soft continuation of maintenance, which is in its own way the most boring and most comforting kind of history. The history of keeping things going. So tonight, softly, calmly, we can keep the facts in one jar. Flinigay, vats, ammonia, Vespasian's tax, coins that do not smell. The steady logic of turning waste into revenue and revenue into stability. And in the other jar, keep the human texture, the embarrassment people might never admit, the relief of receiving clean clothes, the tired humor of workers who have seen everything and still have to stomp another tunic before lunch. Let it all remain gently undramatic. Just a long chain of ordinary decisions. Breathe in for 4, out for 6. Imagine the workshop fading into quiet. The vats are still, the cloth is hung. The street outside has settled into late evening sounds. Somewhere, a public container sits, doing its silent civic duty, and no one looks at it with romance, because it doesn't need romance. It only needs to exist. And if your mind drifts now, let it drift. Let it wander through stone streets and lamplight and the soft, pointless miracle of people inventing systems for the things they cannot avoid. The mallet taps once more. The water settles. The cloth hangs, drying. The city continues, not because it has a grand plot, but because someone, somewhere, is always doing the quiet work of maintenance. And that work, like sleep, does not need an ending. It's strange how a policy can live inside something as quiet as a file folder. Not a marching order, not a shouted speech, just paper that sits there and waits, with its edges slowly softening, as if time is trying to blunt what it contains. And yet, for the boarding school system, the paper mattered. The paper did the long work. The paper could outlast the people who signed it. It could outlast the buildings. It could outlast the excuses. It could even outlast the memory for a while, because memory gets tired and paper, unfortunately, does not. If you're listening from somewhere comfortable, just notice the small comforts for a second. A blanket, a pillow, a quiet room that belongs to you. That's not a dramatic point. It's just a simple one. The system we've been circling around was full of rooms that did not belong to the children inside them. And one of the ways we know this now is because somebody wrote it down in a tone that tried very hard to sound normal. And if you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe if you want. Or don't. Either way, the records will remain in their boxes, and the work of reading them will continue, slow and careful, the way all difficult truths have to be handled like fragile paper that tears if you rush. The thing about records is that they were never made for comfort. They were made for control. A child arrives, and the system begins to translate a living person into categories. Name, age, assigned number, date of entry, progress. Discipline notes, work duties, haircut, noted like a routine maintenance task, language, listed like a problem to be corrected. You can almost feel the administrative satisfaction in the neatness of it. Humans love neatness, especially when the reality underneath is messy. And the schools were, in their own way, factories of neatness. Neat uniforms, neat schedules, neat rows of beds, neat rows of names on a roll call sheet, sometimes crossed out later with a calm line of ink. In the early days of the system, and in its long middle years too, the paperwork was often framed as evidence of good intentions. Attendance records, enrollment lists, reports to supervisors, budgets for food and coal and shoe leather, letters from administrators describing civilizing efforts as if culture were a stain you could lift with the right product. And you can picture the people writing these reports tired, confident, convinced, or simply following a job description using the same tone you might use today to file a quarterly update. Nothing urgent, nothing emotional, just the comforting grammar of bureaucracy. That's one of the unsettling parts. The language can be so ordinary. If you read a line that says a child was removed or transferred, it can sound like a shipping process. If you read that someone was discharged, it can sound like a hospital. If you read that a student ran away, it can sound like misbehavior, a small scandal, a story that ends with a stern lecture. The words can be smooth, like stones in a river, and it takes time, slow time, to notice what the words are smoothing over. Breathe in for 4, out for 6. You don't need to force your mind to focus. Just let it float along the surface of the details, because the details are often where the truth hides. Not in grand statements, but in small notes. Sometimes there were photographs. Group photos with lines of children arranged for the camera, a visual kind of paperwork. Before and after images, staged like an advertisement for transformation. The camera doesn't shout either. It just takes what it's given. And what it was given was an idea. That identity could be edited, like a picture, by cutting hair, changing clothes, changing names, changing language. The strange thing is that we can see the staging now. We can see the performance. We can see how the image was meant to be used. And still, the faces are there. The faces keep returning your gaze. Paper and photos are stubborn that way. They don't let you fully escape into abstraction. Letters are another kind of record, and they can be even more quietly revealing. Some children wrote home if they were allowed. Some families wrote to their children, and the letters were delayed, filtered, withheld, or shaped by the rules of the institution. A letter is usually a small, soft object. It's the written version of a voice trying to cross distance. But in a system built on separation, even a letter becomes something suspicious, something to supervise, something to ration, something that might carry the wrong kind of memory. And then there are the gaps. The blank spaces where something should be, a missing entry, an unclear date, a name spelled 3 different ways, an entire file that simply isn't there anymore because records were lost, destroyed, or never kept with care in the first place. Bureaucracy loves to pretend it is complete, but it often isn't. It is thorough about the things it cares about, funding compliance appearances, and oddly casual about the things that would be most human. What the child felt, what the child wanted, what the child remembered at night when the lights were out. This is where the work of archives becomes important and also strangely patient, because archives are not dramatic places. They're quiet rooms, climate-controlled, full of boxes that look identical, with labels that use simple words, correspondence, admissions, reports, medical, cemetery. A person sits at a table, sometimes wearing gloves, and turns pages slowly because the paper is brittle and because history, when handled properly, is handled gently. There is a kind of sleepy rhythm to it if you ignore the content. Open a box, lift a folder, read a line, make a note, return the folder, repeat. It's like a very serious form of tidying, except what you are tidying is the past. A lot of the most meaningful work in recent years has involved communities and researchers pulling these scattered pieces together. Sometimes the records are in government archives. sometimes in church archives, sometimes in local historical societies, sometimes in the back rooms of institutions that would rather not be asked questions, sometimes in family collections, letters kept in drawers, names remembered in stories, photographs that survived because someone hid them, protected them, refused to let them be thrown away. It's also worth noticing how many different kinds of records can exist at once, like overlapping maps. There are enrollment ledgers that say who arrived. There are payroll records that say who worked there. There are inventory lists that tell you what the school bought: soap, fabric, needles, boots, mundane evidence that a place was functioning day to day. There are disciplinary logs that read like a school trying to prove it was orderly. There are inspection reports that sometimes say too little, and sometimes in small polite phrases say more than they intended. There are death certificates where the language becomes even more careful, as if careful language could make loss less real. And then there are cemeteries. Cemeteries are records too, just written in a different medium. They are the archive of the ground. Some are marked clearly with stones and names. Some are marked poorly with numbers, or not marked at all, because the system that documented so much could still fail to document the most basic dignity. Sometimes graves were moved. Sometimes they were forgotten. Sometimes they were never properly recorded. Sometimes an institution closed, the land changed hands, buildings were repurposed, and the quiet fact of a burial remained beneath new grass, new fences, new uses. History is not always a straight line. Sometimes it's a layer cake, and not in a charming way. Modern investigations into burial sites can involve a strange mix of tools: archival documents, oral histories, old maps, aerial photographs, ground-penetrating radar, careful excavation when appropriate, and long conversations with families and communities who have carried questions for decades. It can feel almost surreal that something as advanced as radar is used to answer something as ancient as, where are they? But that's what the work often comes down to. Not a grand debate, just a quiet, persistent effort to locate, identify, and acknowledge. Sometimes the clues are painfully mundane. A line in a report about influenza or tuberculosis, a note about an outbreak, a mention that the school, cemetery has been maintained, which can mean almost anything. A budget request for coffins, written with the same tone as a budget request for coal. And sometimes the clues are not in official paperwork at all, but in memory, an elder recalling a fenced area, a story about children who never came home, a family that remembers a name that isn't on any list because the list was made by someone who didn't care to spell it correctly. There's a mild, dry irony here that is almost too perfect for bedtime, except it isn't funny. Institutions recorded attendance more carefully than they recorded loss, and sometimes recorded loss more carefully than they honored it. The system loved the idea of order, but order is not the same as truth. And so later, the work becomes untangling, taking a neat record and asking what it actually meant, who it served, what it erased. It is the historian's version of reading the fine print after the contract has already changed your life. Names matter in a particularly tender way in this context, because names were one of the first things the system tried to reorganize. A name is a small word, but it's also a thread that ties you to family, to language, to place. When names were changed or simplified, it wasn't just a clerical mistake. It was part of the process of turning a person into something the institution could pronounce, file, and manage. Pronunciation in that setting was not about respect. It was about control. The name became an administrative convenience. So when communities work now to restore names, to speak them properly, to connect a record back to a real person, it's not merely symbolic. It's corrective. It's the slow reversal of a system that insisted a child could be rewritten. A restored name is a way of saying, you were not an entry, you were not a number, you were not a case, You were you even when the paperwork tried to disagree. The process is often slow because it involves piecing together fragments. A baptismal record here, a school roster there, a census entry that lists a child at home and then later doesn't, a letter that mentions a sibling, a photograph with names written on the back in faded pencil, and every so often a match clicks into place, like a puzzle piece that was under the couch the whole time, quietly waiting for someone patient enough to look. There are also public acknowledgments, reports, commissions, hearings, memorial events that attempt to bring what was hidden into the open. This can look like formal language, careful language, the language of institutions trying to be accountable. Sometimes it helps. Sometimes it feels too late. Sometimes it feels both helpful and too late at the same time, which is honestly a very common feeling in history. The past does not hurry to become understandable. It makes you work for it. But even when the work is formal, the most meaningful moments often remain personal and small. A family receiving confirmation, a community holding a ceremony, a name read aloud in the correct language, a survivor speaking, not with a desire to entertain anyone, but with a desire to be heard without being turned into a spectacle. Respect becomes the quiet rule. The tone matters. Not because tone fixes anything, but because tone is part of how you treat a subject. And heavy history, handled badly, becomes a second kind of harm. If you need a modern analogy, think of trying to recover photos from an old broken phone. You have fragments, you have corrupted files, you have partial backups, you have timestamps that don't match, and you have the frustrating sense that something important is there, but you can't quite reach it yet. Now replace the phone with an archive and replace the photos with names and lives, and you get a sense of why the work can take years. The difference is that here, recovery isn't just for nostalgia. It's for dignity. The records also reveal something else, almost accidentally. The system was not inevitable. It was built. It required funding, staff, policies, transport, enforcement, cooperation. It required people to decide repeatedly that this was acceptable. That's an unsettling realization, but it's also a clear one because things that are built can be examined. They can be named. They can be dismantled, at least in their legacy, by refusing to let them remain vague. And that brings us to the quietest part of all. What remains when you close the box? When the archive room lights switch off, when the pages are back in their folders. What remains is still not a tidy conclusion. It's an ongoing relationship with the past, shaped by memory, by research, by community work, by the stubborn persistence of families who keep asking questions, even when the answers are slow. Keep the facts in one jar: dates, policies, rosters, reports, cemetery maps, ledgers, the steady hum of documentation. Keep the human in another jar: voices, songs, the softness that survived, the names that keep returning. Let the jars sit side by side without forcing them into a neat ending, because neat endings are part of what institutions love, and the subject does not owe anyone neatness. Breathe in for 4, out for 6. If your mind wants to drift now, let it drift. Imagine the archive room, quiet tables, boxes stacked carefully, labels written in plain ink. Imagine someone turning a page slowly, not to dramatize the past, but to meet it honestly. Imagine a name being found when spoken, then carried back to the people who have been waiting for it. And then, gently, imagine the room going still again, the paper resting, the work continuing tomorrow. Because the past, like a long file of documents, doesn't end so much as it waits patiently, endlessly for someone to keep reading. Keep the facts in one jar: policies, dates, rosters, signatures, the neat little rectangles of ink that insist they were just procedure. Keep the human in another jar: voices, nicknames, songs half remembered, the way a name sounds when it's finally said correctly and not shortened into something convenient. And when the jars start to feel too heavy to hold at the same time, you don't have to force them together. You can simply set them side by side like two quiet objects on the table and let them be what they are without turning them into a performance. There's a temptation, especially in modern storytelling, to tie everything up with a strong sentence that sounds like a door closing. But this history doesn't really do doors, it does drawers. It does folders. It does boxes. It does long shelves that keep going even when the lights are turned off. And so the gentlest ending is not a conclusion, but a small promise. To keep looking without turning pain into spectacle. To keep listening without demanding a perfect narrative. To keep the pace slow enough that dignity can stay intact. If you need a bedtime rule for heavy history, it can be an oddly simple one. When you read a record, don't let the record be the loudest voice in the room. Let it be evidence, not authority. Let it be a clue, not a verdict. And if you find yourself drifting because this is a sleepy channel and you're allowed to drift, then drift in a way that still leaves space for respect. Not the sharp kind of respect that feels like a lecture, but the quiet kind that feels like lowering your voice in a library. Breathe in for 4, out for 6. Imagine the sound of a train wheel clicking softly in the distance, not as a dramatic symbol, just as a tired piece of machinery doing what it does. Imagine a bell that rings and then holds its breath. Imagine the archive room again, the slow turning of a page, the careful return of a folder to a box, the calm understanding that tomorrow the work continues. Somewhere a name is being carried back to the people who have been waiting for it. Somewhere a song is being remembered without being asked to entertain anyone. And here, in the quiet, you can let your thoughts loosen their grip, because the truth does not disappear when you rest. It waits patiently, like paper, like memory, like the night itself, listening and keeping the names safe until morning.